Hello, my name is Snizhana Zhygun and I'm an associate professor at Borys Grinchenko Kyiv University. My research interests are focused on ideological influence on women's and children's literature. The topic of this lecture is national matter and Soviet children's publishing companies in Ukraine in 1920s and 1930s. I will show you how Soviet children's literature marginalized national identity in national republics for the sake of Russia in Soviet time. The lecture is based on the results of the analysis of more than 800 publications of the children's publishing houses Dytvydav and Molodyi Bilshovyk, housed in the rare books collection of the National Library of Ukraine for Children. These two publishing houses represent the Bolsheviks' policy on children's literature in Ukraine. Dytvydav specialized in literature for children, and Molodyi Bilshovyk focused on literature for young people. I used distant reading to analyze the publication description, especially the headings and keywords. The detected recurring concepts were considered as proposed to young readers in the context of the children's contemporary reality and were of particular research interest because they demonstrate the worldview that was being formed and supported by Soviet children's books of this period. Despite the fact that the research does not deal with the artistic or ethical didactic qualities of the texts, such methodology allows us to avoid the selectivity of the narratives and to look at the literature which was offered as a certain template. Catriona Kelly, in Children's World Growing Up in Russia, 1890-1991, notes that from the earliest days, the leaders of the new regime were child-oriented not just as the recipients of nurture, but as an audience for political ideas. She has shown the way in which children were taught to become auxiliaries of the Soviet Union, to become part of its civilizing mission by means of education and the art. Lisa Kirschenbaum, investigating the social education of preschool children in the Soviet Union in 1917-1932, concludes that the Bolsheviks conceptualized children as independent, rational, and powerful agents of revolution. Felicity Ann Odell's study Socialization through Children's Literature, the Soviet Example, reveals the specific role assigned to children's literature in Soviet society in their purposive socialization of the child to officially approved norms. She notes that character education was intended to build such traits as collectivism, discipline, love of the workforce, patriotism, internationalism, and atheism, in accordance with the code of the builder of communism. These ideas are really valuable and valid, but there is an issue that Western scholars have not covered well enough so far, since they are primarily focused on Russian Soviet material. The analysis of national corpora of children's literature shows that one of the tasks of making children good Soviet citizens was deprivation of any national items. The analysis of our corpus clearly confirms Soviet society's rejection of national traditions even under the conditions of the policy of Ukrainization in the territory of Ukraine. This policy caused an active development of Ukrainian culture in the 1920s, but since 1932 it has been curtailed. Nevertheless, thanks to Ukrainization, the number of children's authors increased dramatically. New themes and genres appeared. In particular, advantage literature began to develop actively. The ideas of Ukrainization also caused the sensitivity to children's literature to national issues in certain books. However, the analyzed corpus shows that the main trend is replacing national identity by national uncertainty. There are 342 authors altogether in the corpus, but the Ukrainian classic authors are represented only by 10 authors with 39 titles. Such indifference to Ukrainian classics can be compared with the attitude of the Bolsheviks to Russian ones. Already in January 1918, Narkompros began reprinting the classics of Russian literature, having printed 115 titles with a total circulation of more than 6 million by May 1919. The involvement of Russian classics in school education was promoted by Maxim Gorky. The corpus also includes 10 works of national folklore and one edition devoted to Ukrainian history, which makes up only 1% of the corpus. Here I need to explain that Shevchenko's works about Cossacks and Haidamaks were considered classics in the research. Namely, the pushing of the national past to the margins also took place in a way of silence for the new generations. The low percentage of publication on Ukrainian history contributed to the denationalization and formation of the identity of the Soviet man in place of the Ukrainian national identity. It is also need to mention that authors who wrote about Ukrainian history for children were later repressed. We do not know the fate of such authors as Grigory Babenko and Vitaly Tal. They just disappeared, but we know exactly that Oksana Stishenko died in a Soviet concentration camp. The group of texts in which a certain ideology is urged includes 140 editions, or 17% of the whole corpus. Of course, both the Soviet transformation in the countryside and the theme of industrialization, which I discuss later, also have the imprint of ideology. But the subtopics considered in this section are in particular those represented by the following keywords: Revolution, 22 titles, Civil War, 68 titles, Pioneers, 33, Little Octobrists, 8, Soviet Holidays, 12, Lenin, 19, and Stalin, 18. The war that began after the October coup was civil only in Russia, but this name was used as a universal one, despite the fact that the Russians invaded the republics proclaimed after the collapse of the empire, as it was with the Ukrainian People's Republic 1917-1921. As Justus Herzog has argued, the unification of the narrative of the Civil War was an important element of Soviet propaganda project to shape Soviet citizens to willing soldiers of a unified socialist state. The writers avoided deepening into the national characteristics of the struggle, mentioned all opponents as bandits, and fixed the difference of the struggle in the republics mainly at the level of landscapes. Milena Shubertova has mentioned that in general, the stories about war for children are often linked with the motif of separation from home and entering into a group of elders among whom the protagonist finds their patrons. That makes a story of initiation. The high proportion of stories about the Civil War indicates a desire to encourage children to leave their family traditional circle and join the new Soviet community like the characters of the stories do. The personages about whom children could read in our corpus are the ones who create a certain model for self-actualization and who may affect the identity formation of the younger generation. There are 94 persons mentioned in the corpus. 46 are scientists, 21 are Soviet officials, 17 are historical figures, and 10 are writers. Only 8 out of 94 persons are Ukrainians from pre-Soviet times, and 5 out of them are leaders of popular uprising which were presented as socially determined. 21 names of Soviet officials, by the frequency of their appearance in the corpus, dominate all the other names by far because there are as many as 84 titles about them in all. In addition to Lenin and Stalin mentioned above, children were told about Vasil Chapayev, Clement Voroshilov, Mykola Shchors, Semyon Budyonny and Sergei Kirov, Artem, Valerian Kuybyshev, Pavel Postashev, Yona Yakir, Amangen Uldy Imanov, and Semyon Rudnev. Most of them are not connected with Ukraine at all. However, Komsomol members mentioned in 4 titles, whose death became a symbol of the sacrifice for Bolshevik ideas, were from Ukraine. These examples were given to children just on the eve of World War II. The analysis clearly demonstrates how ideology defined the worldview offered by children's literature in the first decades of the Bolshevik period in Ukraine as a member state of the USSR. For example, the theme of village, representative of rural settings, which is related to nature, underwent significant ideological influences. The early 20 years of the Soviet power ruler were marked by a rapid urbanization of rustic Ukraine. According to the 1926 census, the rural population of Ukraine was almost 18%, but in 1939 the number of people living in cities reached 38.5%. That is, it almost doubled. And in industrial regions, urban population surpassed the rural population. People moved to the towns during and after the terror famine, which was in Soviet Ukraine in 1932-1933 and killed from 3.5 to 5 million of Ukrainians. However, the corpus demonstrates the marginalization of the rural areas, which is represented by only 63 titles, that is, only 7.7%. But 30 titles of them made works about Soviet transformations. Collective farms are talked about in 18 texts, and the same number of titles are about collectivization. Another 12 texts demonize well-to-do landowners who oppose to socialization of the land and means of production. Therefore, it can be concluded that the ideological manipulation in the representation of the village becomes a battlefield for Soviet transformations, but in fact, the battle was being waged against Ukrainian national ideas and traditions. Conventionally, the rural world of Ukraine in children's literature was rapidly urbanizing. The theme of urbanization is represented by 122 titles, that is 15%. The key words of the topic are industrialization, 11 titles, metallurgy, 7, factory, 12, electricity, 7, energy, 14, mining, 12, machinery, 11, industry and production, 11 each, construction, 9, communications, 8, transport and infrastructure, 25. These titles include both works of fiction and popular science publications, that explain how certain processes take place. Industrialization, which children were to join in the future, was shown as the pride of the Soviet Union. The focus on Soviet achievements also influenced the fact that out of 122 texts, only 25 texts were translated, and 22 of them were translated from Russian. The predominance of Russia and its representatives was imposed through a disproportionately high percentage of publications translated from Russian. Thus, domestic authors account for 55%, Russian authors account for 28%, and all other foreign authors totally only 17% in the analyzed corpus. The number of publications that deal with Russia is 30% of the whole corpus, while the rest of the world accounts for about 10% of titles only. All this forms a deformed impression of the global world and of the role of Russia in it. Besides, the remaining republics of the Soviet Union, apart from Russia and Ukraine, are represented by only 1% of publications in our corpus, which indicates that the role of Russia in the Soviet Union is also widely overstated in the inscribed messages to child readers of the time. The analysis of the geographic parameters of the world image created by Soviet children's publications shows the correlation with the interests of the important role of the USSR in the international arena and of the dominance of Russia within the state itself. The research demonstrates that making a new Soviet citizen meant not only the formation of materialistic worldview, political engagement, heroism in labor, and defense of Soviet interests, but for the national republics it also meant the rejection of national distinctiveness and the recognition of Russian supremacy. The analysis of 808 book titles published by Dytvydav and Molodyi Bilshovyk has detected ignoring of national history and national authenticity, and ensuring a privilege of Russia and its representatives in comparison with the national republics in the USSR in the images of the worlds of children's literature during Soviet era.